Hello and welcome to First Luke, a weekly Bible study looking ahead to the reading or readings for the coming Sunday. My name is Carl and it's good to have you with us. We're going to be looking today at a story from John's Gospel in which Jesus calls some of his first disciples. But before we delve into that, if you've not done so already, you might like to download the sheet that accompanies this week's study. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll find the link for that just below the video. On the sheet, you will find the text of today's passage, some other references that you might like to look up that are relevant to what we're going to be thinking about, the questions that we'll be looking at later on, and plenty of space for you to record your own thoughts and observations. So without further ado, let's take a look at John chapter 1, verses 43 to 51. To put it in context, we're in the opening chapter of John's Gospel, and we're looking at those things that really kind of set the scene for everything that's going to follow onwards. And we know that Jesus has just arrived in Galilee, having called Andrew and then Peter to be his first two disciples. The key people in this section are Philip and Nathaniel. Philip, we know, was from Bethsaida, which is the same place that Peter and Andrew were from. And it's possible that Philip responded positively to Jesus because he already knew about him from Peter and Andrew. Nathaniel, we know from John 21 verse 2, was from Cana, which is quite close to Nazareth, and there was something of a local rivalry between the two villages, and that becomes important later on. We're delving into the first chapter of the final gospel to have been written, around 90 to 95 of the Common Era, and it's the gospel that's really laden with symbolic meaning and significance, much more so than the three synoptic gospels, Mark, Matthew and Luke. And it's helpful to keep in mind the story of Jacob's ladder that we find in Genesis 28 verses 10 to 17. That really kind of underlies the conclusion that we will get to in this passage in verse 51. Today's reading forms part of a wider unit that begins in verse 36 and goes through to verse 51. And it's all about the calling of the first disciples. We see Andrew inviting Peter to come and see Jesus, having been called himself. And then we see Philip inviting Nathaniel to do the same, having been called. And the titles that we see given to Jesus through this by the various people he encounters, becoming more significant over time. So we have John the Baptist in verse 36 referring to Jesus as the Lamb of God. But by the end of things, in verse 49, we have Nathaniel calling him Son of God and King of Israel, which almost certainly at this point in time meant Messiah. Those titles would take on more significance as things develop in the gospel, but at that point I think that's likely what Nathaniel meant. And we have the process of Jesus being honoured with these titles and then declaring something significant to those who have honoured him. When Nathaniel initially hears from Philip about Jesus as being the one pointed to in the writings of Moses and the prophets, Nathaniel is profoundly sceptical. And it reflects this local rivalry between Cana and Nazareth. So we see Nathaniel saying, can anything good really come out of Nazareth? I suppose it's a bit like me as a Lancashire lad wondering if anything good could possibly come out of Yorkshire. It's the same sort of dynamic. But Philip is not deterred. He suggests, well, come and see Jesus for yourself. So it reflects the same pattern we saw between Andrew and Peter. Nathaniel, as I say, is sceptical, but his mind is changed by what happens between him and Jesus. In verses 47 to 48, it's likely that what Jesus means when he says, I saw you under the fig tree, is not about Jesus having physically seen Nathaniel so much as having symbolically seen Nathaniel. It could be going back to Proverbs 27 verse 15, and this idea that the more deeply you look into the scriptures, the more you'll find, just as the more you search around the base of a fig tree, the more figs you'll find. It could, on the other hand, refer to the vision of peace, of shalom, that we find in Micah 4 verse 4, that has every person living in harmony and having their own fig tree. But either way, and I think the latter is more likely because it makes sense of Jesus saying, here is an Israelite without deceit. Nathaniel's mind is very suddenly and abruptly changed by this encounter with Jesus. Now, we don't know what it was necessarily that gave Nathaniel this epiphany, but it was very sudden, and I think Jesus is almost amused, maybe even a bit taken aback by Nathaniel's sudden change of mind, and says, well, if you think that was amazing, wait until you see what's coming next. The you that's used when Jesus says that is the plural. So he's talking to all of those first disciples. And he talks about angels ascending and descending from heaven onto the Son of Man, which was his favourite title for himself. It might seem a very strange thing to say, and if we want to make sense of it, this is where we need to think about the story of Jacob's ladder, as I say, is from Genesis 28, verses 10 to 17. Jacob was a dodgy character. There's no other way to put that. He was something of a trickster, and we learned that even as he was being born, he was trying to pull his older brother Esau's leg back as they were exiting the womb. So right from the off, there's this rivalry between the two of them, and Jacob will go on to con Esau out of his birthright as the eldest brother. Esau, you can understand, was absolutely furious when he discovered what had happened, and he wanted to kill Jacob. Jacob was forced to flee for his life with not much else other than the clothes on his back. But he has an encounter with God in a dream. He sees angels ascending and descending a ladder that went up to heaven. And he's told by God that one day he will be able to return in peace and prosperity. So it's a quite remarkable dream that Jacob has. And he names the place where all of this happened Bethel, which means God's house. That would later become an important sanctuary. It would become a centre of Israel's early worship. And later on, that kind of idea of God's house being somewhere where God would always be present when you came to worship was associated with the Jerusalem temple. So I think what's going on here is Jesus is kind of claiming that for himself, and taking on how he's both fulfilling the promises that were made about the temple and yet bettering them. So it's almost like he's saying, when you look at me, you'll see what happens when heaven and earth are fully open to each other. I think that is the full significance of what Jesus is saying. And it takes us back to verse 14 of John's Gospel, to the very end of the prologue, where we're told that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. You could translate the Greek as tabernacled amongst us. And that goes back to Exodus and the journey of God's people in the wilderness, where God was with them in the tabernacle. So there's an awful lot of significance and symbolism and meaning packed into this passage. Now, I think this is a passage that looks ahead to the insights that Nathaniel will get later on as he and the other disciples journey with Jesus. And it means that Nathaniel represents a type of person. There's a typology here. And Nathaniel is someone who had doubts and skepticism, in this case fueled by his prejudices about Nazareth, that was overcome by encountering Jesus. He's an example of someone who has a life-changing epiphany. And it begs some very interesting questions. Questions like, how can we be like Philip in our own contexts by inviting people to come and see Jesus? Questions like, does it matter if we know what led to Nathaniel having this epiphany moment? Questions about why we might write people off because of where they come from, in the same way that Nathaniel had initially, when I can say it, done about Jesus. And questions about whether we've experienced something for ourselves of this promise of heaven and earth seeming to come together in the person of Jesus. And of course, our key question each week, how is this good news for today?